Okay, I believe this is where we left off last time in class, was talking about punishment within the criminal justice system and the different justifications that we have socially for punishing offenders, right? So the first one is retribution or moral vengeance, which society inflicts on the offender because the idea is that they should suffer comparably to how the victim suffered or to the suffering that was caused by their offense, right? So it's kind of like known, retribution's more like getting even or vengeance, right? Deterrence is using punishment to discourage further crime. So we talked about this a little bit about the kind of deterrent effect of being punished yourself means that you're less likely to commit a crime in the future. At least that's the goal, right? Though we know some crimes have stronger deterrence than others. And there's also what we call the kind of specific and general deterrence, right? So we talked about this a little bit. The idea that, like, if you're speeding on the freeway and you get a ticket, then that would be a specific deterrent, meaning it's specific to you. You get the ticket and you're like, well, I don't want to speed on the freeway anymore because I don't want to get a ticket, right? Or I don't want to have to pay that again or go to traffic school, which, oh my God, I've done and it's so awful, right? Now they just do it online. I'm like, you guys have no idea what the suffering was before that. Anyway, but then there's general deterrence, which would be more like when you're driving down the freeway and you see someone else being pulled over and you think to yourself, wow, I got to slow down. I don't want to get a ticket, right? So that them being punished doesn't just stop that person being punished, but the idea of deterrence is that it deters everybody from those crimes, right? And this is part of the whole reason why we make sure that in our criminal justice system that almost all cases are open to public review. The idea being that people see the consequences or the penalties that people get, and that could serve as a deterrent. Again, take my crim class, we talk about that for like all day, right? Another justification for punishing offenders in our criminal justice system is rehabilitation, right? This is what we say we do with our system. It's seeking to reform an offender and prevent future offenses. And research has shown that a very effective rehabilitation process is giving people either job training or college education while behind bars, because often that's going to give them the economic opportunities to turn their life around when they leave, right? Versus a lot of other people, if they get a felony status, if they spend time in jail, they've very likely lost their job. And then finding another job when you have a criminal record is very difficult. So having a college degree, having job training skills that can actually be applicable is very important, right? Like, so for example, in California for many years, we've used prisoners as firefighters, right? So getting all of these men who are often paid about $1 an hour to stand on the front lines of these fires and fight these fires, right? Often kind of, digging trenches around them to create fire breaks or things of this nature. So like back-breaking work for sometimes, over 12, 15, 16-hour shifts. Again, $1 an hour. Oh, and oftentimes they can get reduced time as a result of this as well. And so when you think about that, it could be a kind of a rehabilitation adjacent process because you're learning to be a firefighter. That's a skill. That's a job that pays well, right? But big asterisk there is that most, if you're a fire department, you're not going to hire someone with a felony record. So you have these men who are qualified, not just trained and qualified, but like literally have fought on the front lines of fires. Yet when they leave prison, they're not able to get those jobs as firefighters, even though they have, again, the knowledge and experience, largely because of their criminal records. So there are some complications when it comes to this rehabilitation stuff, that sometimes the system, the way it's set up, actually causes a lot of problems for people to reintegrate to society. And as we talk about in criminological stuff, is that if people don't feel connected to society, then they have less reason to not reoffend, right? If you can connect someone back to society, they're a lot less likely to kind of recidivize or end up back in the system again. So the last justification for punishing offenders in our culture is societal protection. The idea that we're protecting the public by using incarceration or execution to prevent an offender from committing future offenses. And this is particularly important when it comes to violent serial people, right? Like predators that often, whether it's violent assaults, whether it's, armed robberies, whether it's sexual predators themselves, whether, rape of women, rape of children. You have these violent offenders that are often quite atypical to the population, yet they commit so much of the violence that we see. So when we look at the statistics and we see such high rates of violence in the culture, it would stand to reason that there's a lot of people committing violence, but often it's a lot of these predators and these repeat offenders using violence over and over, right? So it is important in some aspects to, at least in our kind of societal understandings, to lock someone away and throw away the key when we think that they're not, they can't be rehabilitated, or we think that, they've committed a crime so egregious that in a lot of states we actually put people to death for the crimes that they committed, right? Though, of course, in crim, we talk about how the kind of message that sends and the kind of problematic nature of executions. So anyway, take my crim class. That's a plug for my crim class. But anyway, it's really important to kind of understand how we justify this to ourselves, to understand the kind of narratives that underlie how our system works. Okay, so does punishment work? So although common sense really suggests that punishment is going to discourage crime, our country has a really high crime rate, especially when it comes to criminal recidivism, right? Meaning people ending up back in jail for later offenses, even though they previously been convicted. So the idea is, if going to jail itself is such a deterrent, why are people ending up right back there a couple years later, right? So it kind of goes against our common sense idea that it is being a deterrent, right? So there's increasing criticism of mass incarceration, because right now we have an unprecedented over 2.2 million people behind bars. And obviously just locking people up has not actually had a significant impact on the actual crime rates in this culture, especially due to the fact that a lot of the people, the majority of the people locked up right now, are in jail for non-violent, petty drug crimes. And as a result, you have a lot of people that maybe could be going to drug treatment programs or something else that's not just financially more, kind of on the nose, a little less costly, but also has the opportunity to reduce recidivism, or the likelihood that they end up in prison for the same stuff again, right? So, punishment is not necessarily resulting in societal protection, right, in the way that it's supposed to. So that's why some people advocate for what's called restorative justice. So restorative justice, this is a response to crime that seeks to restore the well-being of the victim, the offender, and the larger community that was lost due to the crime. So courts that embrace restorative justice, they want to bring together the offender and the victim to engage in dialogue about what happened, why it happened, and how the event itself affected each of them. And what's really powerful about this, again, I think I mentioned that in class, there's like a million YouTubes about this, where you can see people sitting down with like the person who shot them in a robbery and talking about how it dramatically changed their lives. And it's really fascinating to see how we're kind of two sides to the same coin, whether it's victim and offender, that we're tied together through that experience. And that by creating this restorative justice, not only do you bring healing to that victim, but also you give opportunity to the offender to understand what they did wrong, to reform their actions, and to move forward in a way where they can actually kind of, atone for what they've done, right? So people have been using this model in some ways, and it is very effective at kind of moving people past those issues of anger and sadness and violence and all of these kind of problems where we pit each other against each other, right? Instead, having an open dialogue about what happened, how much it affected you, is a really impactful way to kind of deal with these issues and kind of get more to the root of why this is happening and how much one event, one choice can have an impact that dramatically changes someone's life, right? Another kind of different approach is what's called community-based corrections. So community-based corrections are correctional programs that take place in local communities rather than behind prison walls. So I know, for example, this is a process that's ongoing right now in New York because of the just horrendous conditions in Rikers Island prison, where people are in there sometimes for years just awaiting a trial on very petty charges. And as a result, there's a lot of problems that they face. They're trying to transition away from Rikers and have more like borough specific kind of community-based corrections programs. So it should be interesting to see how New York takes that on as a challenge with so many people. But anyway, the real reason being that there was some very high-profile cases of violence and, people killing themselves after leaving Rikers and things of this nature. For example, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with the case of Khalif Browder, who was detained for supposedly stealing a backpack, which he did not do, and was held for a very long time within Rikers, was beaten by guards, was beaten by inmates, went through a lot of mental health stuff, and as a result, when he left, because basically the whole process of Rikers is they're trying to get you to say that you're guilty and plead out, right? And he was like, I'm not guilty, so I'm not going to say I'm guilty of something I'm not guilty of. And the consequence of that was the kind of psychological torture and physical violence and pain that he experienced within the prison that, once he left, he was an advocate for closing Rikers, but soon the mental health issues overwhelmed him and he ended up killing himself. So that's kind of what spurned on some of the community-based corrections stuff within New York. Okay, moving on. Some of the community-based corrections that we kind of already use are probation or parole. Right? So probation is a policy of letting a convicted offender stay in the community as long as they have regular supervision and, under conditions that are imposed by a court, right? So you might have to, let's say it's a drug charge, then maybe you have to do drug testing, you probably have to get a job and work a certain amount of hours, and you have to go check in with this person on a regular basis, your probation officer, to keep, track of your progress, basically. There's another kind of probation called shock probation. And so by using shock probation, this is used to show an offender the seriousness of the crime while avoiding a long-term prison term, right? So the judge will impose substantial prison sentence, but then order that only part of the sentence is served in prison and the rest is served on probation. Right? So that's why we have a situation where some people are on probation for years and have to go through these kind of constant check-ins and monitoring and things like that can get very cumbersome and also kind of be very difficult to manage. Parole is another example. Parole is a policy of releasing people from prison and they're going to serve the remainder of their sentence under supervision in the community. So when we look at these from the criminal justice research, does probation work? Does parole work? Well, probation and parole definitely cost less than keeping someone in prison. And they do reduce overcrowding, which is a big problem that we have in prisons, especially largely due to the war on drugs, where we started kind of just throwing people in there like crazy. And it also makes sense to use prisons for offenders who are committing serious crimes, right? While monitoring those who are committing less serious crimes within their own community. So there is a lot of evidence to show the effectiveness of these programs. Okay, so moving on to social policy and the death penalty. So some people say, is the death penalty a social problem? Some people say it's a solution to problems of crime within our culture. So it really comes down to, what do you think is causing crime, right? So if you think it's something that's, more of a biological issue or more of a psychological issue, right? As we discussed a little bit previously, when you look at the evolution of criminological theories, you see this kind of movement from biological causes to psychological causes. But either way, it's what I think is the most fascinating about the death penalty is whether or not it's an effective deterrent. Right? So what we see is, when we look at national death and gun and violence rates and all these fun things, we find that there's an interesting relationship between states that have the death penalty and states that don't, and the amount of actual murders within those states. Meaning that when you look at these things in a per capita range, there's actually tends to be more homicides within areas that have a death penalty than those that don't have a death penalty. So it kind of goes against our common sense understanding of the death penalty as a deterrent, right? And what's really fascinating is the research has kind of explored this to try and understand why would it not serve as a deterrent, right? So they'd ask some of these people that are convicted and they're on death row, and they ask them, why did you commit this crime if you knew you could be on death row for this? And the majority of people say, well, it's because they didn't think they would get caught. So it's interesting how effective something is as a deterrent is definitely connected to the likelihood of actually being caught, right? Okay, so moving on to some of the different crime theories. I kind of set up the biological, psychological for a second there, but anyway, we'll jump into that. So in the kind of earliest understandings of crime, well, really the earliest just said that we had like the devil in you, and you had to like break open someone's skull to let the demon out or whatever. Thankfully, we stopped doing that, but we moved into this kind of space where we understood crime to be caused by biology, meaning, whether it's your brain, obviously the most early version of this was very racist and very based in this kind of like trying to support eugenics and this kind of white supremacy stuff that really said that there are people that are like somehow less human than other humans, and therefore they're more likely to commit crime, which again is just not real. But in more modern era, biological theories are usually based in like neurocriminology, or looking at brain scans, things of this nature, to try to determine the extent of maybe the shape and issues within the brain that often affect your actual behavior. Right, so that's kind of interesting. Just like with biological research, psychological is pretty similar, because often psychological is also looking at the brain, or in this case, more abnormal personalities. Some research has looked at brain scans. And what's interesting about this is there's this one particular researcher that he spent a lot of time doing brain scans of people on death row or, convicted of violent crimes, and trying to see if there's certain anomalies that are present that, you could kind of see as a predictive thing. So you could scan someone's brain and see whether the likelihood of their violence, but it's not that predictive. What's interesting is it's kind of where that nature v nurture pops in, right? So obviously your biological makeup is important, but so is the society that you live in and the kind of social environment in which you live in, right? So what's interesting is this guy's doing all these brain scans of all these people that had, convicted murderers and stuff like that. And he finds this one particular brain anomaly as a pattern. And then he's telling his mom all about it. And she says, hey, be careful, because, there's a high profile murderer in our own family. And he's like, what? And he found out his great aunt or whoever it was Lizzie Borden, right? The woman who famously chopped up her family with the axe and totally got away with it because people were like, women couldn't possibly do something that horrible. So anyway, really interesting thing. He's like, oh, wow, okay, I'm related to Lizzie Borden. So he did a brain scan of himself and of his bunch of his family members. And what he found out is that they also had that brain anomaly. So it's a really interesting phenomenon. Then he started doing, high-profile CEOs of certain companies and things like that wanted their brain scans, and he started noticing they had those anomalies too. And so what he found out was, this kind of like sociopathic brain anomaly doesn't just mean that you're going to be more violent or whatever, that the social environment matters. Meaning that sometimes being a CEO and being in a boardroom and laying off 10,000 people is not a thing I could do personally. I care too much, right? I would feel horrible about it, especially because I understand the statistics of how many people are laid off versus how many people, as a result of that, lose their home or die. So anyway, I'd be like too absorbed in those numbers to handle that. But if you're going to be successful in the kind of ruthless capitalism, vulture capitalism we live in, then, being a sociopath would actually help you. Right? So what's fascinating is it's the social environment, meaning instead of moving towards violence and killing people, maybe it's, this researcher achieving his PhD and kind of being at the forefront of his field, right? That competitiveness that's driving him is similar to that same brain anomaly that's affecting the kind of violence within these other people. So it's just really kind of an interesting phenomenon where he thought he found a very predictive pattern of like, okay, if you scan someone's brain, that's a criminal. But then he realized it's obviously much more complicated than that, because you can still have a brain anomaly, but if you have family and friends and people that support you that, keep you in line, versus if you live in a very kind of violent environment where violence is normalized and where you don't have the kind of emotional and social supports, then yeah, that really might affect your likelihood of committing crime yourself. So anyway, it's just an interesting phenomenon. So I'll move on because otherwise I'll just talk all day into this thing. Okay. Structural functional analysis is really looking at why society creates crime. So functionalist theory investigates how any social pattern contributes to the operation of society as a system, right? Or as we talked about, like pieces of a puzzle that fit together. So under this heading, you have Durkheim, right? Who really wants to understand the functions of crime. And so he says that crime affirms a society's norms and values, right? It helps us recognize the boundary between right and wrong, right? Like if you have an older sibling and they would get in trouble for stuff, then you would see them get in trouble and be like, whoa, there's the line. Don't cross that line with mom or dad, right? So often crime can help us clarify the boundaries, and really reacting to crime can bring us together, right? Because, we can kind of come together as a community, and, that's kind of another function that they think of when in relation to crime. So Durkheim's theory asks not why some individuals would engage in crime, but why society defines some behavior as criminal and not others, right? Okay, moving on to strain theory. So strain theory is really looking at how different groups of people basically work within the confines of their own experience, and that kind of produces different results here. So I put up the figure on this slide of some of the kind of basic understandings of the kind of Merton's strain theory that really looks at how, if you accept the goals of society and accept the means, or reject the goals and reject the means, how he basically puts those people into different categories, right? So first you have conformity. These are people who accept the cultural goals and accept the conventional means, right? So meaning, for something like our society, what is the conventional goal of our society? Wealth, right? Comfort, status, wealth, all that kind of crap, having a nice house. What's the means to get it that's accepted in our culture? Well, typically you get a good job, or you have privilege, or you have wealth that you inherited, right? But typically, at least the way in the societal narrative, it is that you get an education, you get a career, and therefore you got money, conformity, right? And what's interesting about this is that when it says accept or reject, sometimes it's not as simple as like you just decided to accept or reject it. It's kind of an oversimplification for your access to it. So meaning ritualism is when you accept the conventional means, and it doesn't mean you reject the cultural goals in the way of just like, oh, I don't want it, right? I always use my parents as an example of ritualism. So ritualism basically being that my parents knew, well, I mean, my dad still plays the lotto and he's got it all spent in his mind, but they knew working their jobs that they weren't going to be millionaires, that they weren't going to make it into some upper echelon, or have all the fancy things, right? But they still went to work every day. They still went to school. They still did their stuff. And they just, that's the kind of ritualism is that. So it's not that my parents rejected the cultural goals of like having a bunch of money. It's just that because of their professions, they didn't get there, right? So what's interesting is innovators. I think these are the most fascinating ones. So innovators are ones that they accept the goals. So they want the money, the status, the power, but they reject the means, meaning they don't go about it by going to college, getting a good job, whatever. Unfortunately, innovators could also be like those stupid social media influence people. But I like to use the example from my mentor's book about these Dominican drug robbers and how they didn't have legitimate opportunities towards high-paying jobs. So when the crack market dropped out and they weren't able to sell for, any real money, they decided to start robbing dealers. And the way that this worked is kind of this innovation, because you're not using the conventional means, right? Of you're supposed to go to school and you're supposed to get a job and all this stuff. Like robbing drug dealers is definitely not the conventional means, but the conventional goals were still there. The goal was to have that status, that safety, that house, that financial wealth, right? That society kind of tells us is just a given. So retreatism is one response to a lack of opportunities. So people turn away from both the approved goals and the legitimate means. But again, are they turning away, or are they just limited in their ability to do it? But anyway, so some people would say retreatism would be, I don't know, people who are, let's say, completely underemployed, or maybe the homeless could be an example of retreatism, right? So you're not trying to achieve the conventional goals of society, of like wealth and all that stuff. And you're definitely not going about the conventional means of doing it, versus like the ritualists, who they might not achieve the goal, but they're trying, right? The retreatists are not. They're not engaging in that system. But again, oftentimes that's not a choice. It's more about, it's a choice within a very narrow set of opportunity choices, right? And then rebellion, I think, is the most fascinating one. So rebellion involves not just rejecting conventional goals and means, but also advocating some entirely new system. So instead of dropping out of society the way that retreatists do, rebels come up with a new vision of how to live, playing out their ideas as members, of a new group, or, with new goals. So some examples of this are kind of wild, right? It could be like religious cults. Not a great example of rebellion. I think my favorite example I like to give of rebellion, which definitely differs from your textbook, would be like the tiny house movement, or maybe these people that like live in vans, right? There's a lot of like younger millennials that they realized how crazy expensive home buying is. And so they basically reject the cultural goals of society. The cultural goals of society, having all that money, having that big ass house. By having a tiny house on wheels, they reject this kind of, you can't accumulate all the crap, right? And think about it. We all work ourselves to death for 40, 50 plus years of our lives just to have a bunch of crap to put into a bunch of rooms and a bunch of houses, right? It's a weird system. And most of us just take that for granted. Like, yep, that's what it is. So it's interesting with rebellion, they're saying our goal is not to have a bunch of things, and our goal is not to have a big ass mortgage or a house that you basically just have to pay off for the rest of your life. Their goal is to be debt free. Their goal is to be able to travel and see the world, right? Or at least like, I guess, what you can drive to, right? So, they're coming up with a new vision of how to live. And so I think that's kind of a better version, or even kind of like the people that are just like hippies that live off the grid. Like, I guess they're not hippies anymore, but you know what I mean? Like actual communes of people who, they don't have, they get their water from a well. They don't have plumbing. They just use solar panels for all their electricity, things like that, that they've created their own new way of living that has different goals, like sustainability and not having to rely upon those infrastructures. That is just not the goal of previous the cultural kind of standards, right? So it's just, that's kind of my example of it that I think helps people figure out the differences between these ones, right? So, patterns of rule breaking are going to depend on, first, whether or not people accept the goals of society, and then second, whether or not society actually provides people with the opportunity to reach those goals, right? Okay, moving to Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin's opportunity structure. So whether or not people turn to deviant behavior, in their view, depends not only on access to legitimate opportunities, such as, jobs or schooling, but also on access to illegitimate opportunity, such as the chance to learn how to carry out crime. Right? So they say that patterns of conformity and criminality are likely to reflect what they call this relative opportunity structure, right? Like if you grow up in a situation where, sure, you don't get a good education, but you are taught how to steal cars, then that's going to kind of push you in one direction towards more deviance or criminality, right? And then lastly on this slide is control theory. So control theory argues that strong social and emotional attachments to others, so basically just being integrated or well integrated into the community, is what discourages people from engaging in crime. So if you're attached to other people, if you have access to conventional opportunities like jobs or education, If you have involvement in conventional activities, like you're able to go to community events and be included within that community, right? And the belief in righteousness of cultural norms and values, you're going to then reform your behavior and kind of bring yourself back to society, right? But if you don't have that well integration or that strong integration into the community or the social ties that keep people in the community, then you're much less likely to kind of be deterred from committing crime. You're much more likely to commit crime when you don't have those social connections to the community. Okay, moving on to symbolic interaction analysis. So they look at how we socially construct reality, right? They're always talking about symbolic interaction just says we make meaning when we interact with each other, right? So symbolic interaction theory just explores how people construct a reality in our everyday interactions, and all of these other theories are kind of under that umbrella of symbolic interaction, right? So Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory just basically says whether a person moves more towards conformity or towards deviance really depends on the relative degree of association they have with others who either encourage conformity or discourage conformity, right? So it's kind of going like differential association theory to me is like you're hanging out with the wrong crowd kind of thing, right? If you've ever heard that, like, oh, you shouldn't be hanging out with so-and-so, they're one of the wrong crowd, then you know what differential association theory is. The idea that if you're like, let's say you're in high school, right? There's always like the cliques, like the tropes about the different cliques of kids. But let's say you're hanging out with all the like ASB nerds and they're all trying to get into like Ivy League schools and all of that kind of stuff, then you're probably going to be more conformist yourself, right? But if you're hanging out with like the more weirdo fringe groups and, those people smoke cigarettes and do drugs and drink and just general like ditch classes or things like that, then if that becomes normalized to you because of your association with those folks, then that becomes much more a normal behavior for yourself, right? We are social animals, so we tend to bring ourselves to the norms of our group. So if our group is very deviant, then often so are we. All right, so then labeling theory takes this in a slightly different direction. This is Becker. And so labeling theory is just an idea that crime and other forms of rule breaking result not so much from what people are doing, but more so from how others respond to what people do, right? So in labeling theory, we talk about this idea that when you label a person and you say that they've done something bad, oftentimes this does kind of exclude them, right? And labeling can really affect a person's self-identity, meaning your ego can only handle so much negativity. So if someone's saying you're a bad kid, oftentimes they do that to try and encourage you to be better, but ultimately they're pushing you into this label. What's interesting with labeling is that oftentimes kids will lean into this, meaning, you tell them, oh, you're a bad kid, you're a bad kid. At first they think to themselves, no, I'm not a bad kid, I'm not bad. And then after a while, being associated with that deviance becomes part of that kid's identity through the label. Just in the same way if you say, oh, your mom's like, you're the most handsome boy, right? And says that to you all the time, which I say to my cat, then, you're going to internalize that and believe that that's true. Just in the same way, if someone says you're a piece of crap or you're worthless or you're never going to amount to anything or you're a bad kid with bad intentions, then you're going to internalize that too. And the behavioral differences come from how you've internalized that label, right? So the key from labeling theory is like, just let people be people and make mistakes and give them the opportunity to reform. Otherwise, you label them and you push them towards more deviance. Okay, moving on to Lemert, looking at primary versus secondary deviance. So basically, when we talk about deviance within the context of like labeling theory or a symbolic interaction, the idea is that how people react to someone committing a crime or doing something that's considered deviant also can affect their deviant identity, meaning the reaction people have to the primary deviance can either provoke secondary deviance or can kind of deter that, right? So if it provokes secondary deviance, it just means that that person begins to change and now base choices more on their deviant identity, right? So kind of like with labeling, they are told, it's the way people react to what happens to them. And so we can already see the kind of ways that this could be a problem within the bias in our criminal justice system, right? So some people, they commit a crime and it's like, oh, no big deal, slap on the wrist, kids will be kids, they make mistakes. And then when you take, and that's often a privileged identity kid, right? You have like a young white kid is going to get the slap on the wrist, right? Versus, especially if they're coming from a middle class or wealthier community. But if you have, a poor kid of color that does the same thing, we know that, especially within schools, we have what's called the school to prison pipeline, where in some places kids get, again, sent to the principal's office, they get a slap on the wrist, maybe they get a detention hour, versus in other schools, because of the deviance associated with certain communities, meaning we associate the poor with being more criminal. We associate certain communities of color with being more criminal. Again, even though the data doesn't bear that out, it's more of our social bias or prejudice. So as a result, those kids, even though they do very little, are considered more threatening and therefore put into, often situations in the criminal justice system. Like I just heard of the story very recently where these young black girls were arrested for not breaking up a fight from other students at the school, which is completely insane. And these girls were like elementary school students, right? Which you would just never see that headline happen in a middle-class white school. You would just never have like 4, 11-year-old white girls get arrested because they didn't break up a fight. And you're like, why are they supposed to break up a fight? Like the whole thing is insane, right? But it's the deviance attached to the racial or ethnic identity that gets applied to these girls that then makes them considered more deviant, because our culture is very racist and therefore, determines worth based on these societal hierarchies. So anyway, basically the whole point with primary and secondary deviance is, for some, that reaction to the primary deviance is what pushes them towards secondary deviance. And then Goffman talks about the power of stigma. So stigma is a powerful negative social label that radically changes a person's self-concept and their social identity, right? And oftentimes when it comes to any contact with the criminal justice system, this is incredibly stigmatizing for people, right? Not only is it something where you get excluded from the community, but you often have to put on, like every job application, if you've been convicted of a felony or any of these things, that it creates a stigma that affects the way people see each other. So if they know someone went to jail, even if they were innocent, it doesn't matter, because the connection with the criminal justice system makes people seem deviant. So therefore it's like, well, even though you were exonerated, well, they wouldn't have taken you in if you weren't guilty. And it's like, of course they would. That's just how it works sometimes, right? So, oftentimes the negative social label, so in our case it would be a felony status, is that kind of label that not only does it legally restrict you from a lot of things like, financial aid, public housing, food stamps, things of that nature, voting in a lot of cases, it also just creates a stigma that kind of assumes that you're dangerous, that you're bad, that you're violent, and that can really affect people's treatment, right? Okay, so continuing on with some theories, we got social conflict analysis, right? So they're looking at crime and inequality. So conflict theory often looks at how laws are written, right? So, for example, the kind of best example of this would be the 100-to-1 rule, right? So I wish we could get into that a little bit more. But again, take my crim class. But basically, when crack cocaine became an issue in American society, they determined that the sentencing rules would be different for crack cocaine than for powder cocaine, right? Now think for a second. Who is associated with using crack cocaine? What social class is associated with using crack cocaine? What racial group is associated with using crack cocaine, right? People of color, poor people, right? Who actually uses crack cocaine? People pretty consistently across ethnicities and social classes, right? Especially at that time. There was actually a lot more white people using it at that time. And within the first couple years of enforcement in LA County, not one single white person was arrested for crack cocaine, which is completely insane. But anyway, so what's interesting was during this time period, they decided to, put a criminal sentencing difference between powder and crack cocaine. So now think about it this way. Who's associated with powder cocaine? Who do we think of when we think of powder cocaine? How, what's their social class? What's their race? If you're like me, then you think of like the Wolf of Wall Street kind of folks. You think of like those stockbrokers, the rich guys, right? The guys on their mega yachts doing just piles of coke, right? So it's interesting that what they decided to do was create a sentencing discrepancy where if you had, again, 100 to 1. So if you had 1 gram, well, actually, technically it's 5, right? 5 grams of crack cocaine, you hit a mandatory minimum sentence. But to hit that same mandatory minimum sentence for powder cocaine, you had to have 500 grams, right? So think about this. A gram being, very small and 100 being like over an envelope. That basically it's the difference between someone having something in their pocket and someone having a briefcase full of drugs, and saying that that's the same penalty, when it comes to incarceration in the criminal justice system. So you'd have to have way more powder cocaine to get in trouble than you need for crack cocaine. You needed just a real small amount, right? So what does this do? This propels, arrest rates. And of course, it's just pretty obvious who it's tailored to, right? The rich folks that are creating the laws are the ones who are doing cocaine. So they're going to make it so that there's less of a sentencing problem for their buddies. And so, that's kind of one example of how the law is written itself really affects outcomes, especially when it comes to inequality. And the 100 to 1 rule during the Obama administration was, changed, right? Reformed, quote unquote. So they changed it to a lesser designation. So now it's 18 to 1. But I'm sure you know how math works. 18 to 1 is not the same as 1 to 1. So there's still a discrepancy to this day, but it's not quite as egregious as it used to be, though it is still stupid. Other conflict stuff they would look for in conflict theory is like which neighborhoods police are patrolling, right? Which of course is going to affect how many people end up in prison, because if you don't have cops around to see the crimes or to be there present to respond to those things, then it's kind of becomes fish in a barrel. You end up with more people of certain communities in prison because of the kind of hotspot policing. And as a result, it kind of skews our understandings of the criminality of neighborhoods and really sees it as a geographic issue and not as, that crime is actually quite widespread throughout many communities. Also, who ends up getting arrested and who ends up not, right? We know in the criminal justice system, police have a lot of discretion as to who they think should be arrested and who they don't, right? There's that kind of Gabby Petito case that was going on where I think they've confirmed it's her body. I'm not 100%. But basically, this girl goes missing. She's on a road trip with her boyfriend. She goes missing, and he arrives home, and she is not with him. And then he goes out for a trip and can't be found, right? Or at least that's the situation at this point. So, there was a police intervention within Moab, Utah, where a passing motorist saw the boyfriend battering the girlfriend, Gabrielle Petito. And so they called police, and police responded to what was a battery call. And she was very upset and crying and whatever. And she said something about her anxiety. And if you hear what she's saying in the video cam footage, you actually do see a lot of the issues of coercive control and domestic violence kind of come up. Like she's blaming herself for everything, this and that. So anyway, long story short, I'll go off on this forever. Basically, the first cop, he does a good job of trying to suss out what's going on. The second cop walks up and basically supplants his issues with his ex-wife onto the situation he's dealing with. So clearly this dude doesn't have training, and he definitely has an axe to grind with women. He starts basically commiserating with the offender, saying like, oh, well, women, oh, my ex-wife used to always do this kind of crap. And basically twists the entire narrative of what he hears from this woman into being her fault. So basically they put her in the back of the cop car to calm down. They just take a statement, they pal it up with him for a while, and then they get him a hotel room for the night. And basically this was a touch point where, they had the opportunity to potentially even prevent her death, right? We're not even 100% on all the details yet, but it wasn't long after this that she disappeared and they stopped traveling together. And as a result, she never made it home. So the police discretion to say, like, this guy seems like a good guy because he looks like me, he sounds like me, I don't like my ex-wife, right, really affects seeing him as a criminal. Or even just the examples I gave in class the other day, like for some of these mass murderers that go in and shoot up an entire building full of people, but then you get the Burger King on the way to prison, right? Because some sick part of these people see something of themselves in these folks, right? And it's the same issue with prosecutors, as prosecutors have a lot of power as to choose who they charge or not, right? So they can basically look at something and say, okay, this person, yeah, I have enough evidence to try to convict them, or at least force a plea bargain, while other people that do have a lot of guilt, they might have more power, more connections, more money, and as a result, they don't go after them, right? So, like the Jeffrey Epstein thing, the guy who like literally trafficked children, he sexually trafficked children, and he got a slap on the wrist. He got the kind of issue where he got to go home from prison every day. So he only had to spend the night in prison. And then every day he just got to go home to his huge lavish mansion. And they're not even sure because the police guard from the prison didn't get to go inside with him. So he could have been offending girls that whole time. That he was actually being quote unquote incarcerated, right? And people are still looking into why the prosecutors let this happen. Definitely the guy was a billionaire, so maybe money was part of that reason, or the fact that he sex trafficked with a lot of very high profile people. Like, he had, Prince Andrew on his plane to Pedo Island. They called it Pedo Island. Come on. Pedophile Island? I mean, they were not subtle, right? So this guy just got away with everything he did. Largely because he had the power to get through it, right? So they get to determine who gets charged, who doesn't, and often it reflects who has power and who doesn't, right? Is who kind of gets away with it and who doesn't. This is why we know that wealth matters in the criminal justice system. If you don't believe me, then why do you wear a suit to court? Because the judge is richer than you. And if they see someone that looks like them, that they can relate to in some way financially, then they're like less likely to put you in there for forever. There's something to be said about your cadence, the way you speak, and the fact that this is kind of a predominantly, for many years, women, people of color were legally barred from entering law schools, means that there's just obviously predominantly white male situation with a lot of judges, so that's going to affect who ends up being sentenced for a long period of time as well. So anyway, when it comes to police, prosecutors, judges, a lot of discretion and a lot of bias can lead to a lot of inequality. So Karl Marx really looks at class and crime and says in a capitalistic society, the legal system protects the property of the capitalist class, and that capitalists gain wealth legally simply by doing business, right? While ordinary people who threaten capitalist wealth risk arrest as common criminals or political revolutionaries. Yeah, so a lot of people argue that that is actually the function of a lot of policing, especially within wealthy communities, is to protect property. Okay, moving on to a feminist analysis of crime and gender. So oftentimes it's interesting how gender works into this analysis. There are different ways that, again, in my crim class, we get into this about some of the notions of women not being capable of committing crimes, the kind of chivalry hypothesis, or things of this nature. Sometimes they'll do this thing where if a man and a woman are arrested together, they'll be like, well, he did everything, right? Just say he did everything because we know you didn't do it. But what's interesting, I think, is the gender non-conforming behavior is more punished. So let's say you have a shoplifter that's a man and a shoplifter that's a woman. The man may get a longer sentence than the female. But if it's an armed robbery that's a man and an armed robbery that's a woman will typically get the longer sentence because it's considered a man's crime or a non-female crime, right? The only kind of difference to that would be maybe with prostitution, where the women are the ones who are arrested often, much more so than the men, even though you look at the power differential within that, right? Where women are often poor, hence why they're engaging in prostitution in the first place, and the men often have wealth and more power. So it's interesting that we, in other places, they don't criminalize selling sex, they criminalize buying sex. So there's certain municipalities that are changing this as well to not, victimize women in these situations any more than they need to. But, it is an interesting dynamic when you look at this through the lens of power. Okay, so constructing problems and defining solutions. So, this is just really analyzing crime and violence from different perspectives on the political spectrum. So when it comes to those on the far right, they look at crime and they say it has to do with this national decline, right? So they see rising crime and violence as the work of outsiders, people who don't belong in our society, such as immigrants or minorities, which again, often, of course, do belong in our societies. But those in the far right often blame those communities for the issues in society. Fun fact about immigrants, they have a much lower crime rate, whether it's violent crime or property crime, than native-born folks. So once you get to about second, third generation immigrants, they're just as likely to be as criminal, right? That's part of the assimilation process. Now you're as criminal as all other Americans, right? But there's literally no data to support this idea that immigrants are more criminals. Obviously, there are issues with like certain gangs or certain issues like that. But again, when you look at the actual data, you find that overwhelmingly immigrant communities are much less likely to engage in crime because it creates a marginality for them that might open them up to deportation. So it just makes sense that they wouldn't commit crimes. Okay, so when it comes to conservatives, oh, that's a typo. It says SIME, but it's supposed to say crime, violence, and morality. Ooh, I'm going to fix that after this. Okay. So conservatives believe that effective social controls are needed to keep people from engaging in violent or criminal behavior. And so those social controls are going to be the kind of sanctions, the punishments, going to jail, that kind of stuff, right? Liberals instead look at crime, violence, and jobs. So as liberals see it, crime and violence are really often caused by a harmful social environment, especially when lives are twisted by poverty. Meaning, if you give people the opportunity to choose a life where they have success, they will choose that. But if you give someone the only option they have is to make it out of their neighborhood is to either sell drugs or engage in the underground economy or somehow magically be that one guy that gets a basketball or scholarship or that one guy that gets a football scholarship or whatever it is, then obviously people make rational decisions within the limited opportunity structures that they have. So that's why liberals argue that, a lot of the issues of crime are really about the social environment itself. And if we address those issues, like we address issues of poverty, we get people jobs, we have more affordable housing, stuff like that, that the horrible kind of driver of poverty will not drive people into committing crimes, especially property crimes. And then when it comes to the radical left, they really focus on crime and inequality, like the Marx perspective. So from a radical left perspective, the real crime in society is our nation's economic inequality. So the vast gap that's steadily increased in recent decades, that's leaving opportunities away from many, many people. And so what do we do instead? We often innovate, right? Or we struggle and we try to adapt to the limited circumstances. So this means a lot of people often turn to the underground economy, not because they want to, but because that's the only legitimate opportunity that they're given. Think of it this way. If you want to get a really good high-paying job, right? You got to have a resume, you got to have letters of rec, you got to go through a screening process, you got to, give them your transcripts and graduate college and all this other crap, right? But if you want instead to work for the underground economy, they're not going to ask for your references, right? You want to go sell some drugs? the drug dealer's not going to be like, well, you need to give me the last 3 people you sold drugs with, right? or give me what's your GPA or anything like that. Yeah, there's this documentary I used to show in my crim class, and one of the guys in it, talks about drugs. It's called The House I Live In. And in it, one of the guys talks about how when you have no opportunities due to, job loss, redlining, all of these issues where we've globalized our economy so that all of the industries that used to be in a lot of areas are now offshored or outsourced, that people are left with little to no opportunities. And so people struggle to compete for just like the minimum wage retail jobs. So when you look at that and you say, okay, well, I can make minimum wage and still not pay my rent and still not pay my bills and still not be able to support my family, or I can sell drugs and make way more money than that, right? Then you understand the pull of the underground economy, that it thrives on people not having any other choice, right? People don't want to engage in the violence. They don't want to be in a situation where they could get killed at any moment or get put in prison for 25 to life. Like, they don't want that. But when you give people very few opportunities, people get desperate enough to take those opportunities, right? So anyway, going on from here, basically, a lot of the issues we talk about with social problems and crime is really trying to understand, what do we do to fix things? Like, how do we have declines in drug use, right? Do we add more police? Do we build more prisons? Is that why crime has gone down? Or, as I spoke about in class before, is it politics? Or is it really just demographics, right? Meaning, if the majority of people committing crime are 18 to about 25, or really 14 to 25, then when there's larger demographic groups of young people, we see more crime. But as there's smaller demographic groups of young people, we see less crime. Just like with the baby boomers, when they went through the 60s and early 70s, that's when the crime rate went up dramatically, right? Of course, there was other social issues going on as well, but that had a lot to do with it. It was just more young people. So it's interesting how we have to look at these things. When we look at them sociologically, we look at many factors. We look at many theories. We don't just pick one idea. We look at these things from many different angles to try to, more carefully and completely understand the nature of crime in society.